I lost count of how many vegetables I used to walk right past at my dad's garden and think, why on earth is he growing that? Turns out he was growing at least 15 varieties that you will not find in a single modern seed catalog from the big companies, and every one of them outperformed the hybrids I was wasting my money on. That is what we are talking about today. 20 vegetables your grandparents grew that modern gardeners have completely forgotten. And I want to be straight with you, every single one of these deserves a spot in your garden right now. Some of them are easier to grow than the tomatoes and peppers you're already planting. Some of them taste better than anything you have ever pulled off a grocery store shelf. And the last one on this list is the vegetable that genuinely changed how I think about feeding my family from the garden, because I ignored it for over 20 years before I finally wised up. I'm also going to share a bonus tip at the very end, a simple, old-fashioned preservation trick that ties all of these forgotten vegetables together and makes them worth even more. So let us get into it. Here's the thing that connects every vegetable on this list. Our grandparents did not garden for aesthetics or for Instagram. They gardened for survival, nutrition, and self-reliance. They selected vegetables that produced reliably, stored well without refrigeration, and gave them nutrients through the lean months. Modern breeding has pushed us toward vegetables that look uniform, ship well, and sit pretty on a shelf for 2 weeks. But that came at a cost. We lost flavor, we lost nutrition, and we lost resilience. A study out of the University of Texas back in 2004 actually documented significant declines in protein, calcium, iron, and vitamin C across 43 different garden crops compared to data from 1950. So when I say your grandparents grew better vegetables, I am not being nostalgic. I am being factual. These are vegetables that earned their place through performance, not marketing. And once you start growing even a handful of them, you will understand why they were staples for generations. The first one I want to talk about is one I discovered purely by accident after my dad passed, and I found a jar of seeds in his shed labeled simply turnips. Now, I'd never grown a turnip in my life. I thought they were cattle food, honestly. But I planted them out of respect for him. And within 45 days, I had the most productive root crop I have ever grown in my garden. We are talking about the purple top white globe variety specifically, and here is what blew my mind. You can direct sow them 4 to 6 weeks before your last frost. They handle a light freeze without flinching. The greens are edible and packed with more calcium than kale, and the roots store in a cool cellar for 3 to 4 months without any processing at all. My grandparents grew rows and rows of these because a single 10-foot row can produce 30 to 40 pounds of food when you count both the roots and the greens. That is an enormous return for almost zero effort. I felt foolish for ignoring them as long as I did. Now here's one that pairs perfectly with turnips because it fills the exact same niche of being stupidly easy and criminally undergrown. Rutabagas. Most people cannot even tell you what a rutabaga is, and I include my younger self in that group. A rutabaga is basically a turnip's bigger, sweeter, denser cousin. The variety my grandmother grew was American Purple Top, and it takes about 90 days to mature, so you sow it in midsummer for a fall harvest. What makes it special is the flavor actually improves after a frost. The cold converts starches to sugars, and you end up with something that tastes almost buttery when you roast it. They store even longer than turnips, sometimes 5 to 6 months in a root cellar at around 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Our grandparents were not growing these because they were boring. They were growing them because they were the most reliable winter food source you could put in the ground. This next one took me 3 full seasons to appreciate, and I wish someone had just grabbed me by the shoulders and said, "Grow this." I'm talking about parsnips. Now, parsnips require patience. I'll give you that. They take 100 to 120 days, and the seeds are notoriously slow to germinate. Sometimes 2 to 3 weeks. But here's a secret my dad taught me that I ignored for way too long. You sow them in spring, forget about them all summer, and then harvest after the first hard frost. That frost is the key. It makes them sweeter than carrots. The variety hollow crown has been grown in American gardens since the 1800s, and it is still the best one I've found. One 20-foot row will fill a bushel basket, and they overwinter right in the ground if you mulch them with 6 inches of straw. You can go out in January, pull a parsnip from frozen ground, and eat something that tastes like it has been caramelized. Our grandparents knew this. We forgot it. And if you are finding this useful and you want more of this kind of straight talk about what actually works in the garden, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I put out videos like this regularly, and I promise you will not get fluff. You will get real information from real experience. Now let us keep going because we are just getting started and some of the best ones are still coming. Here's one that might surprise you. Salsify. Some old-timers called it the oyster plant because when you cook the root, it has a mild flavor that some people compare to oysters. Now, I am not going to oversell that. It tastes like a mild, creamy root vegetable with maybe a hint of something briny if you use your imagination. But here's why your grandparents grew it. The variety Mammoth Sandwich Island was in nearly every seed catalog from the 1880s through the 1940s. You direct sow it in early spring, give it about 120 days, and you get a slender white root about 8 to 10 inches long. It is extremely cold hardy. It can overwinter in the ground, even in zone 5 if you mulch it, and nutritionally it is a solid source of iron and potassium. The reason nobody grows it anymore is purely because the food industry decided it was not worth commercializing. That is not a gardening reason. That is a marketing reason. And I do not let marketers decide what goes in my garden. Now, speaking of roots our grandparents valued, let me tell you about celeriac. This is one ugly vegetable. I will not pretend otherwise. It looks like a knobby softball that someone left in the dirt too long. But celeriac, also called celery root, has a concentrated celery flavor that is out of this world in soups, stews, and mashed alongside potatoes. The variety Brilliant is a reliable performer, and it needs about 110 days from transplant. Here's the catch, and I want to be honest about this. Celeriac is fussy to start. You need to begin seeds indoors 10 to 12 weeks before your last frost because germination is slow, often 10 to 20 days, and the seedlings grow at a pace that will test your patience. But once they are in the ground with consistent moisture, they bulk up beautifully by fall. One plant produces a root the size of your fist that stores for months. My grandmother kept them in a box of damp sand in the basement and pulled them out for soup all winter long. Here's one that seems almost too simple to even mention, but it is one of the greatest losses in modern gardening. I'm talking about the good old scarlet runner bean. Now, most gardeners today grow green beans or maybe some pole beans, but our grandparents grew scarlet runners for a triple purpose. The flowers are gorgeous and attract pollinators like crazy. The young pods are edible just like snap beans. And the mature dried beans are a high protein staple you can store indefinitely. The variety Scarlet Emperor has been around since at least the 1800s. They will climb 8 to 10 feet on a trellis or a teepee of poles, and a single plant can produce several pounds of dried beans over a season. I started growing these about 6 years ago, and I now put up 10 pounds of dried scarlet runner beans every fall. That is real food security from a plant that most modern gardeners think is just ornamental. This brings me to something I messed up for years before I figured it out, and that is growing the right kind of lettuce. Now I know what you're thinking. Lettuce is not forgotten. But hear me out. The loose leaf and butterhead varieties your grandparents grew are completely different animals from the iceberg and romaine we default to today. I'm talking about varieties like black-seeded Simpson, which has been in American gardens since 1850, and tennis ball, which Thomas Jefferson grew at Monticello. These varieties are cut and come again types. You harvest the outer leaves, leave the center, and the plant keeps producing for weeks. A single planting in early spring can feed a family salads for 2 months. Modern gardeners rip the whole head out of the ground and replant. That is wasteful and unnecessary if you grow the right heritage varieties. Sow them 3 to 4 weeks before your last frost, keep them in partial shade as summer approaches, and you will have more salad greens than you know what to do with. Now, while we are talking about greens, I have to mention one that my dad grew every single year, without fail. Good King Henry, most people have never even heard of it. It is a perennial green, which means you plant it once and it comes back year after year. It was a staple in European and American gardens for centuries before spinach took over. The leaves taste similar to spinach, and the young shoots can be eaten like asparagus and can be spring. It grows in zones 3 through 9, handles poor soil, and once established, it produces for a decade or more with virtually zero maintenance. You start it from seed indoors about 8 weeks before your last frost, or direct sow it in fall and let it cold stratify naturally. I have 3 plants in my garden that have been producing for 7 years now. 7 years from a single planting. Our grandparents understood the value of perennial food plants. We got lazy and went for annuals that make seed companies more money. Let me shift gears to something your grandmother probably had in her garden, and you definitely do not. Cress. Specifically garden cress, not watercress. This is one of the fastest growing edibles on the planet. You can go from seed to harvest in as little as 12 to 15 days. The variety curled cress was a standard in Depression-era gardens because when food was tight, you needed something you could eat in 2 weeks. It has a peppery, slightly spicy flavor, and it is loaded with vitamin C, iron, and folic acid. You literally scatter seeds on moist soil, press them in lightly, and start eating in less than 3 weeks. You can succession sow every 10 days and never run out. There's no excuse not to grow this. It takes up almost no space, maybe a 2-foot square patch, and it fills the gap while your main crops are still getting established. Here's one that goes hand in hand with the idea of fast, productive food. Kohlrabi. I know kohlrabi is not completely unknown, but I would bet money that 90% of modern gardeners have never grown it. And that is a shame. The variety early white Vienna was a staple for our grandparents, and it matures in just 50 to 60 days. The bulb, which is actually a swollen stem, has a mild, sweet flavor, like a broccoli stem crossed with an apple. You can eat it raw, sliced thin with salt. Kids actually love it, which is saying something. Direct sow it in early spring or late summer, or space plants about 6 inches apart and harvest when the bulbs are 2 to 3 inches in diameter. Go much bigger than that, and they get woody. My dad grew these in between his cabbage plants because they mature so much faster that you harvest them before the cabbage needs the space. That is the kind of practical interplanting wisdom that modern gardening has almost completely lost. Speaking of practical, let me tell you about an onion variety that will change how you think about growing alliums. The Egyptian walking onion. This is a perennial onion that produces small bulbils, which are basically tiny onions, at the top of its stalk. The weight of those bulbils bends the stalk over, and they plant themselves in the soil, which is why they call it walking. It literally moves across your garden over the years. You can eat the bulbils, the green tops, and the underground bulbs, so every part is useful. Once established, a patch requires 0 replanting, 0 purchasing of sets, and 0 fuss. My grandmother had a patch of these in the corner of her garden that had been there since, as near as I can figure, the 1940s. I dug up a few starts from a friend about 8 years ago, and they have been feeding me green onion tops and pickling onions ever since. You plant the bulbils 2 inches deep in fall, and by the following spring you're harvesting. Now here's where I need to come clean about something. For the longest time, I thought growing dried beans was pointless because you can buy a bag of beans at the grocery store for $1.50. I was wrong, and I wasted years because of that thinking. Growing dry beans, specifically heritage varieties like Jacob's Cattle, Soldier, or Vermont Cranberry, gives you something you cannot buy at any price. Flavor. Fresh dried beans, and I know that sounds like a contradiction, but beans that were dried within the last few months cook faster, taste richer, and have a creamier texture than anything sitting on a store shelf for a year or more. A 50-foot row of bush-type dry beans will yield about 10 to 12 pounds of dried beans. That is a serious amount of high-protein food that stores for years in a mason jar. Our grandparents depended on this. They were not paying somebody else to grow their protein. This next one is a root vegetable that got pushed out by the potato, and honestly, the potato did not deserve to win that fight. I'm talking about the Jerusalem artichoke, also called sunchoke. Despite the name, it has nothing to do with Jerusalem or artichokes. It is actually a type of sunflower native to North America, and the tubers taste nutty and slightly sweet with a crisp texture when raw. The variety Stampede is one of the earliest to mature at about 90 days. Here's the thing about sunchokes. They're almost too easy to grow. You plant tubers 4 inches deep and 12 inches apart in early spring, and they will grow 6 to 10 feet tall and produce 10 to 15 pounds of tubers per plant. The challenge is actually containing them because they spread aggressively. My advice is to grow them in a dedicated bed with some kind of root barrier, or in a corner where you do not mind them taking over. I grow mine along the back fence and harvest with a digging fork after the first frost. They store in the fridge for a couple weeks, or right in the ground all winter under mulch. Now I want to talk about a green that has been making a comeback, but still has not gotten the respect it deserves. Matcha, also called corn salad. This is one of the most cold, hardy salad greens in existence. It will grow through winter in zones 6 and above with just a simple cold frame or even a light row cover. The variety vid is the most widely available, and it forms little rosettes of soft, mild, almost buttery leaves. You sow it in early fall, about 8 to 10 weeks before your first frost, and it grows slowly through winter, ready to harvest when absolutely nothing else in your garden is producing. I started growing mache 5 years ago on a whim, and now I consider it essential. It fills the winter salad gap that no other green can fill. Our grandparents grew this because they understood that a garden should feed you 12 months a year, not just 6. Hamburg parsley is another one that vanished from American gardens for no good reason. It looks like flat leaf parsley on top, but underground it grows a thick white root that tastes like a cross between parsley and parsnip. They'll use the tops as a herb and the root as a vegetable. That is 2 crops from one plant in the same space. You direct sow it in early spring, give it about 90 days, and pull the roots in fall. They store just like parsnips or carrots in cool, damp conditions. I found this variety in a European seed catalog about 4 years ago, and I've grown it every year since. It is one of the most efficient uses of garden space I have ever encountered, and I genuinely do not understand why it disappeared from mainstream gardening. Now here's one for anyone who has ever complained about the grocery store price of celery. Cutting celery, also called leaf celery or smallage, is what your grandparents grew before the thick-stalked Pascal celery took over. It does not produce those big, crunchy ribs. Instead, it grows an abundance of intensely flavored thin stems and leaves that are far more useful in cooking. The variety Parcel is an heirloom that dates back centuries. It is dramatically easier to grow than stalk celery because it does not need blanching, it tolerates more heat, and it is far less susceptible to disease. Start seeds indoors 8 weeks before your last frost, transplant after danger of frost is past, and harvest by cutting outer stems all season long. One plant will produce more celery flavor than a whole head from the store. This is the kind of practical, space-efficient crop that made sense to people who actually depended on their gardens. We are getting close to the end now, and these last few are the ones I am most passionate about because they represent a way of thinking about the garden that we have really lost. Scorzonera, also called black salsify, is a root vegetable with a dark brown to black skin and white flesh that is so rich and creamy when cooked that Europeans used to call it the poor man's asparagus. It takes about 120 days to mature from direct sowing and prefers loose, deep soil so the roots can grow 12 to 15 inches long. I grow mine in a deeply dug raised bed amended with plenty of compost. The flavor is milder and sweeter than regular salsify, and the roots hold in the ground over winter even better than parsnips. This is a vegetable that requires patience and faith. You plant it, you wait 4 months, and then you pull something from the ground that tastes like nothing you have ever bought at a store. Our grandparents had that patience. I think we can find it again. Now, the second to last one is a plant that most modern gardeners would look at and think is a weed, but it was deliberately cultivated for centuries. I'm talking about lamb's quarters, also called wild spinach or Chenopodium album. This plant grows wild in most of North America, and if you have a garden, you have almost certainly pulled it out and thrown it away. I know I did, for years. Then I learned that it is more nutritious than spinach, containing significantly more vitamin A, more calcium, and more protein per serving. The leaves are mild and pleasant, perfect raw or cooked. Now, I'm not saying you should let actual weeds run rampant. What I'm saying is that our grandparents deliberately allowed lamb's quarters to grow in their garden rows, harvested the young leaves from plants up to about 12 inches tall, and considered it a free, zero-effort crop. You do not even need to plant it. Just stop killing it, learn to identify it, let a few plants grow in out of the waste spots, and harvest the tender top 4 to 6 inches of growth. It is genuinely one of the most nutritious greens available to any gardener in America, and it costs absolutely nothing. And now the last one. This is the one I mentioned at the start, the vegetable that changed how I think about my entire garden. It took me over 20 years of gardening to give it a fair chance, and I regret every one of those years I wasted. The humble winter squash, and I do not mean butternut or acorn, which are fine but common. I mean the old keeping squash varieties that our grandparents grew specifically for winter storage. Varieties like Blue Hubbard, which can reach 20 to 30 pounds. Candy Roaster, a southern Appalachian heirloom that stores for up to 8 months without any processing. And Seminole Pumpkin, which is heat tolerant, pest resistant, and was grown by indigenous people and adopted by early American settlers. I grew Blue Hubbard for the first time 3 years ago after finding seeds in an estate sale lot. I gave each vine about 60 square feet of space, fed them heavy with compost, and by September I had over 100 pounds of squash from 4 plants. I cured them in the sun for 10 days, brought them into the basement, and we were eating homegrown squash through February. Not canned, not frozen. Just sitting on the shelf, whole, for months. That is real food security. That is what self-reliance looks like. Our grandparents did not grow these because they lacked options. They grew them because nothing else on earth gives you that much nutrition for that many months from a single planting. Once I understood that, I changed how I planned my entire garden. I stopped thinking about what is trendy and started thinking about what actually feeds my family through the year. And that shift, that single shift in thinking, was worth more than any gardening hack or expensive product I have ever tried. Now, before I let you go, I want to talk about a few mistakes that keep modern gardeners from growing these kinds of crops, because I made every one of them. The first is variety tunnel vision. We go to the garden center, we see the same 30 varieties of tomatoes, peppers, and lettuce, and we think that is what a garden is. A better approach is to seek out small, independent seed companies that specialize in heirloom and heritage varieties. That is where you find the Blue Hubbards and the Scarlet Runners and the Good King Henrys. Your grandparents saved their own seed and traded with neighbors. We can at least buy from people who are keeping those lines alive. The second mistake is planting only for summer. Most modern gardeners garden from May to September and then quit. Our grandparents gardened for all 12 months by planting crops like mache, parsnips, and winter squash that produce or store through the cold months. Start thinking of your garden as a year-round food system, not a summer hobby. The third mistake is dismissing unfamiliar vegetables as too difficult or too weird. I did this with salsify, celeriac, and scorzonera for years. Then I grew them and realized they are no harder than carrots or beets. The unfamiliarity is the only barrier, and you get over that the first time you pull a parsnip in January and realize what you have been missing. The fourth is not planning for storage. A modern gardener picks a tomato and eats it that day. Our grandparents grew with winter in mind. If you're not thinking about root cellaring, curing, and drying, you are leaving the most valuable part of these crops on the table. Now, as promised, here is that bonus tip I mentioned at the beginning. This is a preservation method that my grandmother used, and it ties all of these forgotten vegetables together beautifully. It is called sand storage, and it is dead simple. You take a wooden crate or a sturdy cardboard box, put down a 2-inch layer of barely damp, clean sand, lay your root vegetables, things like parsnips, salsify, celeriac, scorzonera, turnips, rutabagas, on that layer without touching each other, and cover them with another 2 inches of sand. You continue layering until the box is full. Store the box in a cool spot, ideally 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, like an unheated garage, a basement, or a root cellar. The sand maintains humidity around the roots while preventing them from touching and transferring rot. Done properly, this will keep root vegetables firm and edible for 4 to 6 months. No electricity, no canning equipment, no freezer space, just sand, a box, and a cool room. My grandmother kept her family fed through Michigan winters with this method, and it costs essentially nothing to do. It is the perfect companion skill for every root vegetable on this list. If you found value in any of this, I would genuinely appreciate it if you would subscribe and share this with someone who might be ready to grow something their grandmother would recognize. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me which of these vegetables you are going to try this season, or better yet, tell me about a forgotten vegetable your grandparents grew that I did not cover today. I know there are more out there, and I would love to learn from your family's experience too. 20 vegetables, every one of them proven over generations, every one of them available to you right now. Stop letting seed company marketing decide what goes in your garden and start growing what actually works. Happy gardening, and I will see you in the next one.